Come with me as once more we dive into the depths of English medieval social history. Dysentery. Hi guys, welcome back to Social History Sunday. Um, Now, I don't know whether many of you will be aware or not, but today, Sunday, 20th of November, 2022, is exactly 750 years to the day since the declaration that made Edward I King of England, 4 days after his father's death on November the 16th in 1272. Unfortunately, Edward was out of the country at the time. He was on what was known as the Eighth Crusade. Well, he was actually on his way home from the Eighth Crusade, which took place in 1271. And he was on crusade with Louis the Ninth of France, not Philip, Louis the Ninth. Unfortunately, Louis the Ninth had died as well of dysentery, which is why Edward was on his way home. And he was having a bit of a jolly. He was visiting friends and family in Italy, Spain, France, on his way home, and taking part in tourneys and just having a right old time. Until eventually he got home in 1274, when in July he finally had his coronation, and he was officially crowned king in 1274. But he'd actually been king for nearly 18 months before he got home. Anyway, so we have as a sort of the main subject of what we're talking about is sort of connected to Edward's experiences, and there's a tie later on in his life as well, we'll get to that, of when he was away on crusade. And it's also connected to the English obsession with drinking beer or ale, getting alcoholic beverages, shall we say. And there's quite a simple reason for why the English are obsessed with beers rather than, for instance, our European continental cousins who were obsessed with wine. Different thought processes, different availabilities throughout the early medieval and on into this day. And we're talking about ale drinking. And why did ale drinking become so ubiquitous within the British Isles? I mean, we actually have archaeological evidence going back some 8,000 years for the brewing of ales. Now, why were they so obsessed with it? Well, there's one quite simple reason. You couldn't drink the water. I mean, it's totally different to today, where you just turn a tap and water comes out. In the Dark Ages and the medieval ages, the Middle Ages, you had to be really, really careful about where you obtained water from and what you did with it before you drank it. For instance, even today, experts will tell you, do not drink from open standing water, such as lakes or ponds, and even reservoirs. Don't drink from it, because you don't know what's died and fallen into the water. And it doesn't take much to contaminate a few million gallons of water. All it takes is one dead body of a sheep or a deer or something like that starts to decompose, and the entire body of water is contaminated. You come along and drink some of that, you're asking for problems. And they would also tell you not to drink running water. Again, if something has died and fallen into the river, if it's within 10 miles of where you are and has started to decompose, if you drink that water, there's a high possibility of you picking up an infection. It's not good. And that's today. Back in the medieval, like Edward's time, late 13th, early 14th century, it was even worse. Mainly because, as well as the risks I've already mentioned, you have a very high rate of animal husbandry going on. I mean, it's estimated that in England alone, in the 13th century, there's some 9 million sheep population of the human population, I believe, was only something like 3. So the people were outnumbered 3 to 1 by sheep. There was a massive amount of pig, with pig being the most popular meat source. There was millions of pigs, hundreds of thousands of cows, which were brought over by whatever, getting off the point. But the problem was their waste was just left wherever it, and it was washed off the land by the rain and ended up in the rivers and in the lakes and also in the water table. Toxic effluent, basically. So you couldn't drink from the rivers, you couldn't drink from the lakes, neither could you drink from wells. Purely and simply because the wells generally in a village, a communal well in a village or in a castle, was sunk into the ground until it dropped below the top edge of the water table. And yes, there was a certain amount of filtration went on with the soil and the rock strata, but not complete. And quite often, I mean, it was a little bit safer if you had a well that had been sunk into a rock formation, if the castle had been built on a rock formation. But if it was a normal water table, you couldn't trust it. So if you couldn't drink the water, what did they do? Well, basically, within the British Isles, and we're talking about England specifically, they made ale. And they got drunk. Well, they drank ale to stave off dehydration. Now, it sounds a little bit sort of counterintuitive, because we know today that alcohol can actually induce dehydration. But they didn't know that. They probably didn't really care. But they actually did things a little bit differently to what we do today. For instance, if you walk into a pub in England today, the chances are there will be very little difference between any of the ales or beers on option in terms of alcohol volume. They'll all be roughly 6 to 10%, 6 to 8% most likely, with only really some of the export beers being a little bit stronger. However, in the medieval period, they've actually brewers have actually experimented with old recipes, and they've managed to produce beers fairly easily that are as high in alcohol as 20% by volume, which is an incredibly strong beer. But as well as those beers, they actually produced 3 types of beer. They had big beer or large beer, which was the most alcoholic. They did a second fermentation off the same mash as produced the first beer, and they called that middle or mild beer. And those were usually between 8 and 10%, similar to what we would have in a pub today. And then you had small beer or little beer, which was only maybe 1, 2 or 3% alcohol. The difference was, back then, all of the ales had a very high calorific content as well. For instance, small beer is thought to have had about 150 to 200 calories per pint. Middle or mild, about 200 to 250. The strongest beers, the large beer, was thought to have perhaps up to 300 calories per pint. So it was actually quite substantial and quite sustaining, which is why the different beers were used so extensively. For instance, if you went out to work in the fields, you would take a flagon or a large covered jug full of small beer, and that would keep you going during the day. And it would also be part of your meal. It would also give you energy, it would sustain you, it would also keep you hydrated. The middle beer especially was drunk almost daily by all adults. The stronger beers were kept for celebrations and parties and things like that. But it was still drunk fairly regularly, mainly at weekends though. The small beer was drunk by everybody. And when I say everybody, I mean everybody, including kids, children, of all ages. Everybody drank small beer. And actually, if you look at the English drinking culture, right up until the Victorian era, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it was still common for children to be to regularly drink alcohol, because you still couldn't drink the water. It wasn't until the Victorians invented water purification on a larger scale, and then continued that with chlorination and fluoridization. Well, the fluoride's a little bit different. With chlorination and produced clean drinking water that you could actually drink, and that wasn't until the 19th century. So we went centuries, and if you look at the continent, there are parts of the continent that you couldn't drink the water right up until the 1980s. Parts of Spain, it was actually quite an in-joke within English holidaymakers, and it said, oh, don't drink the water, because you couldn't drink the water from natural sources, and even out of the tap in parts of Spain, even up until the 1980s. It's a lot better now, but that's besides the point. So getting back to the medieval, and I think the fact that children drank beer quite regularly has carried through to today. Now this is quite interesting. This makes me laugh every time I hear somebody on YouTube in a video mentioning this. Everybody seems to think, and I don't know why this is, that the legal drinking age in England is 18. It's not. That's the legal buying age. In order to buy alcoholic drinks, you have to be over the age of 18. Not to drink them, to buy them. I believe in America, just to drink and or buy, you have to be over 21. In England, that's not the case. The legal age restriction of 18 is to buy alcohol. For instance, it's perfectly legal for a child in a pub to have an alcoholic drink if accompanied by an adult whilst having a meal. Perfectly legal. So if the legal drinking age was 18, you wouldn't be able to have an alcoholic drink in a pub if you were 12-year-old, as long as it was accompanied by a meal. Lots of people gloss over this point. It's also perfectly legal for children within their own home or within a household, a private residence, as long as accompanied by their parents, to have an alcoholic drink at 5 years old. People forget this. It's perfectly legal. Now, I'm not saying that if you had a youngster running around in the back garden completely off his face, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, that that the social services wouldn't get involved at some point. They probably would, and you'd have lots of questions to answer. But it's still not illegal for over 5s to drink alcohol in a private residence. I think that's an interesting throwback. But I can't understand why people have got this idea that you've got to be 18 to drink alcohol in the UK, in England. You don't. That's to buy it yourself. Anyway, back to the point. So we have a situation where people are drinking beer instead of anything else. I mean, they didn't even eat raw fruit very often. Raw fruit, they didn't trust it. It had to be cooked. Which is why we have so many fruit pie recipes. I mean, did you know apple pie, that's supposedly an American invention, the first ever recorded instance of apple pie dates back to Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote the recipe down in one of his books in 12 something or other. So when you say as American as apple pie, sorry guys, it's not American, it's English. Haha. Sorry. Yeah, I was a little bit gloating at that. I'm terribly sorry. So even the fruit and things like that, they were very mistrustful of eating things raw or drinking things raw, because with the apple thing, it was probably somebody gave themselves colic and made themselves ill. Eating brambles out of the hedgerows, they probably just ate so many they'd make themselves ill. So they didn't utilise raw materials when they were raw. They cooked everything. Now, when you're making ale, the process is quite simple. You collect together all your grains, and if after like the 13th century, your hops, and you malt it, which is you let it dry, and then you rehydrate it, and then you boil everything up to release all the sugars from the grains and the hops. You then let it cool, and you start the fermentation process either naturally or by adding yeast, which usually came from bread making. But the yeast itself has an antiseptic an antibacterial action on the liquid as well. So you're double sterilising the liquid, which means that in most cases, by the time it comes ready to drink, you're good to go. And as we said, they already did like a triple fermentation. So by the time you get to the beer that everybody's drinking every day, it's been sterilised 4 times. It's been boiled and then it's been fermented 3 times. So it's quite safe to drink. And they knew this and they utilised this as well. So how does that tie in with Edward I? Well, when Edward was on crusade with Louis IX, he saw Louis die from dysentery, or the bloody flux, as they called it. Now, if you don't know what dysentery is, if you're eating, I suggest you pause and wait till you finished your meal. The bloody flux, dysentery, gives you really, really bad internal gastrointestinal infections. And what it does, you pick it up from water. You can pick it up directly from contact with infected people or with feces, things like that. But it's incredibly virulent, especially in the medieval era. It's estimated that if there was an outbreak in a village or an enclosed community like a castle, that between 30 and 60% of that community would be dead within a couple of weeks from dysentery. Incredibly virulent, incredibly nasty, and if you survived the actual infection phase, chances are you would die anyway because it did so much damage internally. And basically what it does, the bacteria which causes the problems gets into your intestines and colon and basically starts to attack the tissue of your intestines. Now, if you consider that that's where all the waste from your digestion is, it's no surprise that once these ulcers start in your intestines and your colon, that they start to get infected. And they start to bleed quite heavily and quite badly. So you have the massive raging infection going on from the feces within your body. The feces turns to diarrhea, which you've got no control over, and it's laced with blood. Anybody who comes into contact with that, either by caring for you or helping you out, is probably going to catch it as well. You're also going to have massive dehydration. And so usually within 4 or 5 days, somebody who had caught dysentery in the medieval era was dead. And unfortunately, this happened to Edward I as well. That was his cause of death. 1307. He was on campaign, going up north to try and subdue the Scots again. And they stopped to make camp overnight at a place called Borough by Sands, which is I think it's just south of Carlisle, in the northwest of England, in Northumbria. And unfortunately, the area is quite marshy and it's marshland. Now, whether or not he actually caught dysentery while there through contaminated water from the marshes, or if he already had it, just hadn't realised, or if he came into contact with somebody, whatever the cause, 1307, he died of dysentery. And it's a shame, because I think Edward I was quite possibly one of England's greatest kings. Now, I know there are loads of people out there, Scots, Welsh and Irish in particular, who will say he was a tyrant, he was an oppressor, he was an evil man. Yeah, from your point of view. But from the English point of view, he was one of the greatest kings we ever had. He introduced common law, for instance, finalised common law, wrote it into law. The laws that he created, the system that he created, is the basis of the legal system we have today. And if you live in the United Kingdom, you benefit from that system. Whether it's in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, or England, you have the benefits of that system that he set up. So there was lots of things that he did good. Okay, he doesn't get the recognition a lot of the time, but that's the way it goes with a lot of great men. So he died in 1307. He was transported to Westminster, where he still lies today. Now, here's an interesting thing. After his death, his son Edward declared that at least once every century that Edward's body should be examined, and the waxed cloth that he was wrapped in should be replaced in order to preserve his body. Now this was a strange thing to do. Most people were just embalmed. Well, most kings were just eviscerated and then embalmed and then just stuck in a box and left to rot. Edward wasn't. For some strange reason, regular as clockwork, and they've got the records in Westminster Abbey, his body was taken out, well, it was examined and re-wrapped in fresh wrapped cloth, waxed cloth. The last time it was done was in 1740 something. And you know, he was still recognisable. He hadn't decomposed. He was dried out apparently, quite desiccated. But his robes were still in perfect condition. He was buried in the same robes that he was crowned in, that he wore for his coronation. And they were still in perfect condition. So there's quite a bit of mystique around Edward I Longshanks. So anyway, we've come a full circle. From Louis IX dying of dysentery, while on crusade, on campaign with Edward I, all the way through Edward's coronation, looking at the society that tried to protect itself from virulent waterborne diseases like typhoid and particularly dysentery by drinking alcohol, by drinking beer. See, it's good for your beer. All the way through to Edward's death from the same disease. I mean, dysentery, I dread to think how many people actually died for it. I mean, for instance, kings and queens you would think would be the most protected from diseases such as that. And yet there's at least 10 English medieval monarchs that died from dysentery. Probably more, because some of them, for instance, I believe Henry II was described as dying from gastrointestinal vapours, which to me sounds a bit like dysentery. And there's a few cases like that. So if the kings were dying so regularly from dysentery, imagine the decimation it would have on the ordinary populace. Like I said, estimated every outbreak killed between 30 and 60% of the members of any given community. So anyway, thank God we don't live in the medieval era. Would have been interesting, but no wonder people didn't survive very long. Anyway, I've rabbited on enough. Hope you found that interesting. Stay safe, keep slinging the sticks, and we'll talk again soon. Cheers, guys.